Hello and welcome back to the Research Platform, the space where we discuss everything related to research, particularly research from a global South perspective. In other words, things that affect researchers from the global South, issues of interest to researchers from the global South. Today I want us to quickly deal with that component of a proposal called the chapter breakdown. So quite often the mistake students make is to prepare a proposal that does not contain a chapter breakdown. I call it a chapter breakdown. Other people call it a chapter layout, whatever it is, whatever name you give to it. The critical thing is that number one, you must identify it as, a layout of your chapters, a breakdown of your chapters, an explanation by you as the author of the document on how your chapters will look like. Number two, the other critical thing is that a chapter breakdown is not necessarily made up of one-liners or one-sentence explanations. I've received quite a number of proposals where the student writes Chapter 1, Introduction, Chapter 2, Legal Framework, Chapter 3, Literature Review. That's not how you prepare a chapter breakdown. Remember, a chapter breakdown, we said in our other episode, flows from your objectives, which also flow from your research question. So it's your platform now to expand, to expatiate, to unpack what you're trying to do here. Because your research question was compact, it was concise, it was summarized nicely, it was straight and to the point, you're not waffling about. Your objectives sort of expanded your research questions, broke them into little components, or telling the reader what exactly you seek to do, to address that particular research question. Now, when it comes to your chapter breakdown, you're taking those objectives now and expanding them further and telling the reader what exactly you will do in addressing that particular objective. So your chapter breakdown is informed by the objective, by whatever name you call that section of your proposal, whether it's a chapter layout or a chapter breakdown, but it essentially is an expansion on your objectives. I often advise my students like this to say that when you create your chapter breakdown, imagine each chapter as an article you intend to publish in an accredited journal. And the chapter breakdown, therefore, gives you the space to create an abstract for each one of your chapters. So the chapter breakdown is nothing else other than different abstracts of your different chapters. It's critical for you to indicate the chapter breakdown because you're saying to your supervisor, I know where this study is going. I've properly designed it. I can see it down the road. Because remember, the chapter breakdown is the roadmap of the study. It's what you use to navigate. It's like those of us who grew up during the times of what was called an atlas or a map. One of those navigation books that were there when we were young. They had different names, but that atlas or that map, you could take it and open it up and you'd find a map, a road map that could take you from Johannesburg to Durban or from Johannesburg to Maseru, wherever you're going. That is what a chapter breakdown does. It takes the reader on a journey, beginning from your first chapter up to your last chapter. Now, the two simplest chapters to break down are the first and the last. Because the first is always going to be the background and the introduction and the layout, the roadmap of the whole thesis. So it's much easier to construct the first, chapter and to present it in your chapter breakdown. I often advise my students to just get one of the readily available theses online and read how that other author presented their first chapter in their chapter breakdown, and then just take that, tweak it here and there, make it work for you, because your structure, the structure of your thesis, if you're using the same research methodology, is going to look almost exactly the same as any other thesis out there. So grab whatever is available online, advisably from your institution, because you want to follow the same writing style that is followed in your institution, and then see how that person captured their chapter 1 and fashion yours along the same lines. Of course, you're not cutting and pasting, you're not plagiarizing, but you're tweaking this to suit your particular needs, because there's no need to reinvent the wheel. We're not trying to reinvent the wheel here, but we're trying to make research easier and more doable. So grab a chapter out there, chapter 1 from any thesis that's available, tweak it, adapt it, make it apply to your particular circumstances. The last chapter quite often will be composed of two things. You will be concluding there. Over and above concluding, you'll also be recommending. Again, I advise my students to just grab a thesis that's available, see how that other person designed their final chapter, designed their last chapter, and how they presented it in the chapter breakdown. And of course, depending on what you are studying versus what that other person was studying in their particular project, you will then adapt it accordingly. Remembering that those two critical things are there for the last chapter, the conclusion and the recommendations. The last chapter usually gives you an opportunity to now rehash what was happening in the previous chapters. It now gives you a chance to revisit your research question, to revisit the questions you posed in the beginning, and in hindsight, sit back and analyze if you have, through all these 7 chapters or 8 chapters, however long your thesis is, if you have been able to answer those controversies, if you have been able to answer those questions you raised in the beginning. So in the last chapter, you will see a bit of going back and forth, a bit of a reminder or a rehashing of what the previous chapters provided for. You will see an author going back and telling the reader that chapter 1 set out to do 1, 2, 3, and indeed this and that was done, and these gaps were identified, and because these gaps were identified, the recommendations will then be proffered here as a possible panacea to the problem. So that's the one thing that the last chapter does, the rehashing of the entire thesis as you go along. It's basically a platform or an opportunity for you as the author now to test what you've been doing and see if you have really been doing what you said you were setting out to do in chapter 1. You now evaluate yourself in this chapter through the summary that you give of the preceding chapters. Basically, it's a summary of the whole roadmap from the beginning leading up to where you are now in the final chapter. Now, that's a chapter where you also give your recommendations. You've identified the gaps. In fact, the gaps have been identified in the chapters. You are now simply summarizing and bringing them back to the memory of the reader that these are the gaps we found, and these are the recommendations we're going to put forward to remedy that particular gap or those gaps that we identified. So because of those reasons, those 2 chapters are the easiest to construct in order to design and include in your chapter breakdown. The first one, like I said, is simply just a roadmap. It's just an introduction, a background, and it tells the reader what you seek to do, and how you intend to do it. The last one simply goes back and looks at what you have done, what you have discovered, and how you think it should be remedied. What remedies you think are at your disposal to resolve that particular quagmire or to resolve that particular controversy. Now, the most difficult ones are the ones in between. So if I was a student doing a proposal, I would start by simply designing chapter 1 and designing the last chapter that I'll be dealing with, whether chapter 5 or 6 or 7 or 8. It depends on how many chapters you have in your study. It depends on whether you're doing an undergraduate study where I would expect maybe between 4 and 5 chapters, or you're doing your master's where I would expect between maybe 4 if you're stretching it and 6 or 7 chapters, or if you're doing a doctorate where I really would expect 7 chapters, on average 7 chapters. But it depends on the doctoral study that you are dealing with, the field of study you are in, and the methodology that you are using to approach that particular problem. It would also be influenced by the design of your research question, because remember, all these things flow from the research question. So some research questions are couched in a way that they will only give you 5 chapters at most. Others are couched in such a way that you can't stretch it to 8 chapters. But anything beyond that really makes your study undoable. It makes your study too broad. It makes your study too clumsy. You might want to collapse some chapters and combine them into one and play around the region of 7 chapters if you're doing your doctoral. Now let's take the example of a study trying to figure out if the ICC does in practice enjoy universal jurisdiction. Obviously, we've said chapter 1 and chapter last are the easiest. We don't want to talk about those. But your second chapter would most likely be your theoretical framework. But in this instance, I think would move that to chapter 3. Chapter 2 would most likely be the evolution of the concept itself. What is universal jurisdiction and how did it evolve? It is a historical chapter. You'd go back and study how over years states have handled this concept called universal jurisdiction and how leading authorities in the field actually understand universal jurisdiction, or how they have understood it over time, because it's more of a historical and evolutionary study. Your third chapter would then be the current, what's obtaining on the ground now. What is state practice regarding universal jurisdiction now? What do leading authors say? What does customary international law say about universal jurisdiction at the particular moment? Can it be enjoyed? Or at that point you're not trying to understand if it can be enjoyed by international tribunals, just trying to understand what it is, how it presents itself, how it is used. Your fourth chapter would most likely be where you now begin to answer the question whether the ICC has and enjoys universal jurisdiction. And for you to do that, you need to go back a little bit and look at the historical negotiation of the ICC, of the Rome Statute. See how states came together and negotiated this statute. See if there were proposals, to include universal jurisdiction in the Rome Statute. And you'll find that there were proposals, the French proposal, the German proposal, the US proposal, all of which were shot down by states which felt that the ICC or international tribunal cannot really have universal jurisdiction because that cannot be enjoyed by the domestic courts of a state. So roughly we've looked at the first chapter, which we've already said is a roadmap. It lays out how the background of the study and what you seek to do. Your second, which would be the understanding the concept, the evolutionary process. The third, which would be understanding the current framework or the current underpinnings of that particular concept. Chapter number 4, we said you'd look at, you're now beginning to answer the question itself, whether that particular court enjoys universal jurisdiction. Remember, chapters 2 and 3 include a lot of what you call your literature review. You will have had an opportunity in your chapter 1 to present a brief literature review, but in chapters 2 and 3 you'd be going deeper now, interrogating how various authors, how various authorities in the field are presenting arguments either for or against that particular proposition. In your fifth chapter, you would then be beginning to round up, to conclude, and then recommend. So it's as simple as that. That's how you develop your chapter breakdown. The key thing is to treat each chapter as an article you're about to submit to international accredited peer-reviewed journal. You want to demonstrate there that you can craft a proper abstract, an abstract that lays out where you are going with this study, because the supervisor is looking for those pointers. The abstract cannot necessarily be a huge one-pager. No, just a simple cut off a page, or even less, just a few lines, a paragraph that's so succinct that lays out what you intend to do in that particular chapter, because the supervisor wants to see that. The chapter breakdown cannot be composed of one-liners. Chapter 1, introduction. Chapter 2, the evolution of the concept. Chapter 3, current application of the concept. Chapter 4, the history of the negotiation of the instrument, or the history of the negotiation of the Rome Statute. That's not a chapter breakdown. You're just giving out sentences that do not tell your supervisor what exactly you intend to do. When your supervisor sees your chapter breakdown, when he reads one of those paragraphs, when he reads one of those abstracts, he needs to understand that, okay, I can see this person is going to do 1, 2, 3 in chapter 5. And then that gives the supervisor the opportunity, because of the knowledge that and experience that he or she has, to then tell you that, listen, you are missing this point and that point or that point. In some instances, you find that a student wants to analyze things which don't add value to their study. So if you put it in the literature review, your supervisor will then be able to tell you that delete this. It's useless, it's unnecessary. Or you're waffling too much. You're beginning to include things that don't advance your study, things that work against you. Because students have that tendency. That's why it's called supervision. That's why you need a supervisor to tell you that here you're not doing enough. You need to add more. Or here you're doing too much. Slow down, cut down, delete some of these things. The chapter breakdown will also inform your supervisor if he or she needs to instruct you to collapse 2 chapters into one. Because when you lay it out in the beginning, here's the thing about research. That's why when I do research, when I think I'm almost happy with the paper, I give it to anyone. It could be one of my students, it could be one of my colleagues, it could be someone senior than me. And I say, listen, just go through this in your spare time. Tell me if it's making sense or just a whole lot of nonsense. Trust me, no matter how many times you've read your own work, if you give it to a new, fresh pair of eyes, they will pick up things you are not able to see yourself. So when you do that and you give your paper to your supervisor with the chapter breakdown, it allows the supervisor with those fresh eyes to tell you if you have a chapter missing there, or if you should be moving particular elements of the study from a particular chapter and include them in another chapter, or if 2 chapters are basically nothing else but a duplication. Because if you've worked on a paper for so long, you will duplicate some of your objectives and you won't even see, because you're the author of the document. At some level of research, you tend to read over your mistakes. You even read missing words into a sentence. And your supervisor gets this, but there's a missing word there. And you're like, oh, I read that 20 times and it read so well. I didn't see the missing word. In fact, in my head, the word was there. But because this person is not the one authoring the paper, he's coming from an outside perspective. His mind is still fresh. He can see. Even when you're missing a small word like the supervisor can pick it up, like, you're missing that here. It doesn't make sense anymore. So that's how you develop a chapter breakdown. I hope that is helpful in a way. Do leave comments below if you feel there's something else we need to address on this platform. We are here to address the research paucity on the African continent, to ensure that the research on the global south takes center stage as well. So we welcome your comments, we welcome your suggestions, we welcome your criticisms, as long as they are couched, in collegial and civilized wording, because we were not necessarily calling out for uncouth types of criticisms. We're calling for criticisms that are build, that have a tendency to build than to destroy. So leave your comments below, leave your critical analysis below, leave your critical evaluation below. Suggest other areas that we could cover. Suggest other topics that are topical for researchers, for emerging researchers, for students, for postgraduate students, because I can sit here and think that I'm busy dishing out things that people need, but perhaps this is not exactly what people need. Perhaps there are some areas I'm missing out that are critical, that are giving people nightmares and sleepless nights. So do drop comments below. We will endeavor on this platform to bring you that content. We'll go out, because we're researchers after all. We'll go out there, gather as much information and come and share with you. All right, let's keep Africa rising. My boy Africa. Until next time, Angelo TV signing out. Cheers.